30 pairs of boots pounded down a dark country road. Rain came down sideways, cold and hard. One man stumbled and went down on one knee in the mud. Two others hauled him up before he hit the ground. They kept moving. They had no food. They had no shelter. They had no idea where they were. The youngest one was shaking so bad he couldn't feel his own hands. Then a light appeared through the trees. A single lamp burning in the window of a sagging farmhouse. Behind that door stood a 78-year-old widow named Ruth Ellery, alone except for a one-eyed dog. She had almost nothing left in her pantry, and in about 1 minute, she was going to give all of it away to 30 strangers with guns. What made these hardened soldiers come back the next morning by the hundreds? Stay with me on this one. Cedar Hollow, Tennessee. You could drive through it in under a minute and never know you'd been there. One gas station that closed at 6, a church with a leaning steeple, and out past the old feed mill at the end of a gravel road nobody plowed anymore sat the Ellery place. Ruth had lived in that house for 51 years. She raised a family in it. She buried a husband from it, and now she was watching it fall down around her, one board at a time. The porch sagged where a support post had rotted through. The roof leaked over the back bedroom, so she'd moved her bed into the front room years ago. Half the gutters hung loose. The barn door wouldn't close, and every winter the wind found a new crack to whistle through. She knew what it needed. She'd priced it out once at the kitchen table with a pencil and a hardware catalog. The number was so big she'd laughed out loud, alone in an empty house. There was no fixing it. Her whole month came from a Social Security check and a little from selling eggs, and the eggs had slowed down because the hens were old, same as her. Her husband's name was Walt, 22 years in the United States Navy. He'd passed 6 winters back, right there in the front room, holding her hand until he couldn't anymore. She'd buried him under the big oak at the edge of the field because that's where he'd asked to be. She talked to him out there most mornings, told him about the weather, told him about the dog. The dog was Biscuit, a border collie, black and white and mostly gray around the muzzle now. He'd lost his left eye to a fence wire years ago, and it never slowed him down one bit. He followed Ruth everywhere. He slept at the foot of her bed and woke her with a cold nose at dawn. He was, if we're being honest, the only living thing that needed her anymore, and she needed him right back. That night the storm rolled in fast. Ruth brought the hens in early. She put a pot of thin soup on the stove, more water than anything, because payday was still 8 days out. She lit the lamp because the power had a habit of going out in weather like this, and sure enough, around 8 o'clock, the lights flickered twice and died. So she sat by lamplight with Biscuit's head in her lap and the rain hammering the tin roof, and she thought about turning in early. Nothing else to do. Then Biscuit lifted his head. His ears went straight up. A low sound came out of his chest, not quite a growl. "What is it, boy?" Ruth said. He was up and at the door before she finished the sentence. Barking now, not his squirrel bark, something serious. Ruth got to her feet slow, the way you do at 78, one hand on the chair. She picked up the lamp and went to the window. At first she saw only rain. Then a shape moved at her gate, then another. Then more men, a whole line of them coming up her drive in the dark. Big men, soaked through. Moving in a tight, disciplined way that a farm woman didn't see every day. Her heart climbed up into her throat. Now, understand. Ruth lived alone at the end of a road nobody traveled. She was a small old woman with a bad hip and no phone signal in a storm, and a crowd of strange men was walking straight toward her door in the middle of the night. Any sensible person would have blown out the lamp and stayed dead quiet and prayed they passed on by. But Ruth wasn't built that way, and there was something about the way they moved, bone-tired. One of them was half carried between 2 others. There came a knock, firm but not angry, a man's voice hoarse from the cold. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. We're United States military. We got turned around out here and we're in a bad way. We don't mean you any harm. We just need to get out of this rain." Ruth stood with her hand on the latch. Biscuit had gone quiet beside her. He wasn't barking now. He was just watching the door, tail low, waiting. She thought about Walt. He'd told her more than once that the worst nights of his life were the cold ones, the wet ones, the ones where you'd have given anything for a dry corner and a warm bite of something. She opened the door. The porch light was dead, so all she had was the lamp. It threw its glow out onto a wall of soaked, exhausted men. She counted later. There were 30 of them. Faces streaked with mud and rain, lips gone blue, uniforms black with water. And every single one of them looking at her like she was the last dry thing left in the whole world. The man in front, the one who'd spoken, was tall with a hard, kind face. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been marching since yesterday. Training went wrong. We're not hurt, but we're cold and we haven't eaten. Could we trouble you for shelter just until this blows over? We'll take the barn. We won't come inside. You have my word." Ruth looked past him at all those faces, and her eyes stopped on the one at the back. He was young. Just a boy, really, though he had a man's uniform on. He was shaking so hard the two men beside him were holding him up. His head hung down, and Ruth felt something twist in her chest she hadn't felt in a long, long time. "The barn's got a hole in the roof the size of a wagon," she said. "You'll all fit in my front room and my kitchen. Bring that boy in first. Go on. Move." The leader blinked at her. "Ma'am, we're 30 men. We can't ask you to." "You didn't ask," Ruth said. "I told you. Now getting out of that rain before I catch cold just looking at you." And that's how 30 Navy SEALs came in out of a Tennessee storm, into the home of a widow who had almost nothing to give them. But she was about to give it anyway, all of it. They came in dripping and stooping under her low doorframe, one after another, until her little front room was full of them. Big men making themselves small. They sat on the floor so as not to track mud on her chairs. And every one of them, as he passed, said the same 2 words. "Thank you, ma'am." Quiet. Like they meant it. Ruth pointed the young one to the chair nearest the wood stove. The 2 men set him down easy. His teeth were chattering. His lips were the color of ash. And here's the thing I still can't quite explain. Biscuit went straight to him. That dog was a one-woman animal. He tolerated strangers. He did not love them. But he walked across that crowded room, past all those boots, and he put his head right in the young man's lap and he stayed. He leaned his whole weight against the boy's legs, the way he did to Ruth on cold nights. And he would not move. The young man's shaking hand came down and found the dog's fur. And something in his face broke just a little. Ruth got the stove roaring. Then she went to her pantry. "Now I want you to understand what was in that pantry because it matters. A sack of flour maybe half gone. A dozen eggs from the slow old hens. A ham hock she'd been saving. Some potatoes going soft. A jar of green beans, a little coffee. A pot of soup that was mostly water, and 1 loaf of bread, her last loaf. The one that had to get her through to payday, 30 men, and that." Ruth stood there and did the math the way any poor person does it, fast and without complaint. And then she rolled up her sleeves. "You," she said to the later, "what's your name?" "They call me Chief, ma'am." "Well, Chief, you're going to help me. Come light this stove eye. The rest of you, there's a wood pile on the back porch dry under the tarp. I want it in here by the armful. And somebody get water from the pump. We're going to cook." She stretched the soup with the potatoes and the ham hock and the green beans until the pot was full, and the whole house smelled like something worth living for. She cracked every egg into a skillet. She made biscuits, dozens of them, sliding pans in and out of that old oven while the rain roared on the roof. And the bread, that last loaf. She cut it into 30 pieces so thin you could see the lamp through them. And she laid each slice on the edge of a bowl, and not a man there knew it was the last food in the house. She made sure of that. They tried to refuse. The chief said, "Ma'am, you keep the bread, we've had bread." And Ruth looked him dead in the eye. "Son, in my house, when a body's hungry, they eat. That's the whole rule. There isn't another one, now sit down." He sat down. They ate by lamplight. 30 of the toughest men this country makes, sitting on a widow's floor, eating thin soup and thin bread from an old woman who had nothing, and eating it like it was the finest meal they'd ever had. A couple of them, big grown men, had wet eyes, and it wasn't from the cold. The young one ate slow, with biscuits still pressed against his legs. Color came back into his face a little at a time. Ruth pulled a chair up next to him and put a blanket around his shoulders, an old quilt she'd made herself 40 years ago. "What's your name, honey?" she asked. "Danny, ma'am," he said. Ruth's hand stopped on the blanket because Danny was her son's name, her boy. Drowned in the river below the mill when he was 19 years old, 40 years back. She never talked about it. She'd folded that grief up small and put it away where it couldn't cut her every day. But hearing that name in that voice from that shaking boy, it come loose in her all at once. She didn't let it show. She just patted his shoulder. "That's a fine name. You rest now, Danny, you're safe here." And the dog looked up at her with his one good eye, and Ruth understood something she couldn't put into words. Biscuit had known. Somehow, that old dog had known. They stayed a few hours while the worst of the storm passed. The chief sat with Ruth at the kitchen table and asked about her, and she told him a little. About Walt. About the Navy. She didn't tell him about the money. Some things you keep, but she didn't have to because the chief had eyes. He'd seen the bucket under the ceiling stain, the plastic over the broken window, the porch post held up with a stack of bricks, the bare cupboard she'd emptied to feed them. He didn't say a word about it. He just looked and took it all in, and something settled behind his eyes that Ruth didn't notice at the time. Around 3 in the morning, the rain gentled to a drizzle. The chief stood up. "Ma'am, the storm's breaking. We've got to move out before dawn. We've got a rendezvous to make and a long way to go on foot." He paused. "I don't have the words for what you did tonight. I've got men here who wouldn't have made it through this night without you." "That's not me being dramatic. That's the truth of it." "You'd have done the same," Ruth said. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Not everybody would, that's the thing, you did." They filed out as quiet as they came. Each one stopped at the door. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." The young one, Danny, was the last. Biscuit walked him all the way to the door and sat there, and the boy knelt down and put his forehead against the dog's just for a second. "Thank you," Danny whispered. "To the dog, to Ruth, to all of it." Then he stood and squared his shoulders and walked out into the dark to catch up with the others. Ruth stood on her sagging porch and watched 30 shapes jog off down the gravel road and disappear into the last of the storm. She never got their names except the chief and the boy. She didn't know their unit or where they were going. She went back inside. The house was warm and smelled like biscuits. The floor was clean, they'd swept it before they left. And on the kitchen table, tucked under the sugar bowl, she found $40 in worn bills that she hadn't put there. She smiled at that. Stubborn men. She washed the pot and the skillet. She let Biscuit out and then back in. And she lay down on her bed in the front room and thought, well, that was the strangest, sweetest night of my whole life. And now it's over. She was wrong about that. It wasn't over. It was just barely getting started. Ruth woke the next morning to sunlight and quiet. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean. She made herself a cup of coffee with the last of the grounds, and she sat on her porch with Biscuit and wondered if she dreamed the whole thing. Except the quilt was still by the stove where Danny had left it, folded neat, so it was real. It was just over, and that's when she heard it. Low at first, then louder. A rumble way off down the road. Then another, then more, engines, a lot of them. Biscuit stood up and barked. Ruth got to her feet. Over the rise at the end of her gravel road came a truck. A big flatbed stacked high with lumber. Behind it, another. Behind that, another. And behind that, a line of vehicles longer than any Ruth had ever seen on that road in her life, kicking up dust all the way back to the county highway. They pulled into her field one after another, engines growling, and men began to pour out of them. Not 30, not 50, hundreds. Men in uniform, men in work clothes, unloading generators and saws and stacks of shingles and windows still in their wrapping. In minutes, her quiet farmyard turned into the busiest place in the state of Tennessee. Ruth stood on her porch with her coffee cup shaking in her hand. The chief walked up to her out of the crowd. He'd cleaned up. He was smiling. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Hope we didn't wake you." "What?" Ruth managed to say. "What is all this?" "This," the chief said, "is about 800 of your neighbors. Well, not neighbors exactly. Some of these boys drove all night from 3 states over. But every one of them heard about a woman who gave her last loaf of bread to 30 strangers, and not one of them was willing to sit home once they heard it." Ruth's mouth opened, and no words came out. "We're going to fix your house, Miss Ruth," the chief said gently. "That's what's happening here, and I'm going to ask you to sit down in that chair right there and let us." Now I want to stop here for just a second, because if you're anything like me, this is the part where you feel something rise up in your chest. This is why we tell stories like this one. So if this got to you the way it got to me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the best part is still coming. Stick with me. Ruth did not sit down. Of course she didn't. "No," she said. No, I can't let you do this. I can't pay for any of this. I don't have." "Nobody's asking you to pay for anything," the chief said. "It's already paid for. The men are volunteers. There's no bill, Miss Ruth. There never will be." "But I only gave you supper," Ruth said, and her voice cracked. "I only gave you supper." The chief looked at her a long moment. "Ma'am, you don't understand yet what you gave us, but you will. Now please sit down." And this is where the nature of the whole thing changed. The night before, it had been one old woman doing one kind thing for one cold night. Small, private, over by dawn. But now it had grown into something else entirely, something with a size and a force to it that Ruth couldn't stop if she wanted to. It had left her hands. It belonged to 800 men now, and they were not going to be talked out of it. They started before she finished her coffee. A crew went up on the roof and stripped it down to the boards, while another crew stood ready with new decking and shingles. Men crawled under the house and put new posts under the porch. A team pulled the plastic off the broken windows and started measuring for glass. Somebody had a generator running power tools. Somebody else was already framing a new wall in the back bedroom, the one that had leaked for years. It was like watching an anthill, except every ant knew exactly what it was doing. And here's a thing that got me. It was organized. In the few hours between 3 in the morning and sunup, the chief and his men had made phone calls, and those calls had made more calls, and word had traveled through some invisible network of brotherhood that runs under this whole country like an underground river. Feed 30 of ours in a storm and give away your last loaf, and 800 will show up at dawn. That's the deal. Nobody writes it down, but it's real. By mid-morning, Ruth had given up protesting and started doing the only thing she knew how to do. She started cooking. Except she had nothing to cook, so she stood in her kitchen empty-handed and near to tears. That's when a woman appeared at her door. Then another. Wives, mothers, sisters. They'd come too, carrying coolers and casserole dishes and sacks of groceries, and they filled Ruth's bare pantry to bursting. Somebody put a full loaf of bread on her counter, then another, then a dozen, more bread than one woman could eat in a year. The joke went around the crew that day. Give away one loaf, get a bakery. Ruth laughed and cried at the same time, which is a thing you can do when you're 78 and your whole world has turned upside down in the best possible way. Around noon, she found the young one, Danny. He was up on a ladder hammering shingles, and when he saw her, he came down and stood in front of her, and he was different than the night before. Stronger, steadier, but his eyes were the same. "You came back," Ruth said. "Ma'am, I asked too. I asked the chief if I could be the one to tell the others. I made those calls last night, most of them." He looked down at his boots. "I don't think you know what you did for me." "Then tell me," Ruth said. The work went on all around them, hammers and saws and men calling out to each other, but for a minute it was just Ruth and Danny and Biscuit sitting between them in the dirt. "I lost my mother 2 months ago," Danny said. "She raised me alone. There wasn't anybody else. And I've been in a bad place since. Real bad. Last night I was cold and tired, and honest to God, ma'am, I was thinking about how easy it would be to just stop. To just sit down in that mud and stop." He swallowed. "And then your dog came and put his head in my lap, and you put that blanket on me and called me honey, and you looked at me the way she used to look at me, and I thought, all right, maybe I can keep going." Ruth reached out and took the boy's rough hand in both of her old ones. "My son's name was Danny," she said. "He drowned when he was 19. 40 years ago, I never had another. And when you told me your name last night, I thought the Lord himself had sent you to my door." She squeezed his hand. "You keep going, Danny. You hear me. There's people who need you to keep going. I'm one of them now." The boy nodded, and he couldn't speak, and he didn't have to. And Biscuit, that one-eyed old dog, leaned his weight against Danny's leg, the way he'd done in the storm, the way he did for the ones who needed it most. The chief walked up then, and he was holding something, a photograph in a frame, one that had hung on Ruth's wall for 50 years. Walt in his Navy dress uniform, young and proud. "Ma'am, one of my men was taking pictures off the wall so we could paint behind them, and he found this. That your husband?" "That's my Walt," Ruth said. 22 years in the Navy." The chief looked at the photo a long time. Then he looked at Ruth. "Miss Ruth, you didn't just feed 30 strangers last night. You fed 30 of Walt's brothers. Once you're in, you're always in. Doesn't matter the year, doesn't matter the branch. He'd have done what you did without thinking twice. You know that." "I know it," Ruth whispered. "Then let us finish this for him too," the chief said. "For Walt, let us take care of his wife. It'd be an honor." Ruth couldn't answer. She just nodded, and she held Walt's picture against her chest, and she let them work. And work they did. A whole house top to bottom in a single day and into the night by the light of work lamps. New roof, new windows, new porch level and solid that a person could stand on without the whole thing groaning. New paint, soft yellow, the color Ruth mentioned once offhand that Walt had always wanted for the place. Somebody heard her say it, and by evening it was done. They fixed the barn door so it closed. They hung new gutters. They rewired the bad outlet in the kitchen that Ruth had been afraid of for years. They built a ramp beside the new porch steps for her hip without her asking, so she'd be able to get in and out when the walking got harder someday. They thought of things she hadn't even thought of herself. And out at the edge of the field, under the big oak where Walt was buried, Ruth found 3 of the men standing quietly. They'd cleaned up the grave, pulled the weeds, set the leaning stones straight, laid down fresh flowers. And they'd built a small wooden bench there, sanded smooth, so Ruth could sit with her husband on her morning visits instead of standing on her bad hip. She sat down on that bench and she wept. Not sad tears, the other kind. The kind you cry when the world turns out to be so much kinder than you'd let yourself believe. They didn't finish until nearly midnight the second night. And when they were done, the whole crew, all 800 of them, gathered in the yard in front of the house. It stood there in the glow of the work lamps, and it wasn't a sagging, leaking, falling down thing anymore. It was a home, proud and solid and yellow, ready to stand another 50 years. The chief called them all to attention. 800 men snapped to, quiet as the grave, out there in a Tennessee field under the stars. And then he had Ruth come stand on her new porch, with Biscuit at her side and Walt's picture in her hands. "Miss Ruth," the chief said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "there's a thing we say. It means I've got your back. It means you'll never stand alone. Most folks have to earn it over years. You earned it in one night with one pot of soup and one loaf of bread." He turned to his men. "Boys." And 800 voices, all at once in the dark, called out to one old widow the words they'd never said to a civilian in their lives. A roar of them. It rolled across the field and off the hills, and Ruth felt it in her chest like a second heartbeat. She put her hand over her mouth. She couldn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything she'd have said was already there in her face. They left the next morning the way they'd come. In a long line down the gravel road, trucks and cars, dust rising behind them, until the last one crested the rise and was gone and the farm was quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet. It was a full quiet now. Ruth stood on her solid new porch with her coffee in a house that no longer leaked, and Biscuit sat beside her with his one good eye on the empty road. She thought about the storm, about 30 cold men at her gate, about the choice she'd made to open the door instead of blowing out the lamp. Such a small thing, the kind of thing you'd never guess could turn into all this. The young one, Danny, wrote to her after that. Real letters in the mail the old-fashioned way. He told her he was doing better. He told her he'd stopped thinking about sitting down in the mud. Some months later, a letter came with a photograph in it. Danny in his uniform, standing tall, and written on the back in his hand were the words, "Still going, because of you and a one-eyed dog." Ruth put that photograph on the wall right next to Walt. The men didn't forget her either. That's the part that gets me. Through that first winter, firewood would appear stacked by her new porch, and she never once caught who brought it. In the spring, the garden got tilled. A card came every year on the anniversary of that storm, signed by the chief, and then by other names she didn't know, from men who'd only heard the story and wanted her to know they'd heard it. She was theirs now, all of them. Once you're in, you're always in. Biscuit lived 3 more good years in that warm, dry house, and when he finally went, old and gray and worn out, Ruth buried him under the big oak next to Walt, on the spot where he used to lie in the sun. It felt right. The dog who knew things. The dog who walked across a crowded room in a storm and put his head in the lap of a boy who needed a reason to keep going. Ruth lived on in that yellow house for many more years, and folks in Cedar Hollow tell the story still. About the night the widow fed the seals. About the morning 800 of them came back. And every time they tell it, somebody always says the same thing at the end, shaking their head. All she did was open the door. But that's the whole point, isn't it? That's the thing worth carrying home from a story like this one. You never know who's standing out there in the dark and the rain. You never know what one warm meal, one blanket, one kind word might mean to a person on the worst night of their life. Ruth didn't have much. Half a loaf of bread and a pot of thin soup and a stubborn heart. And she gave every bit of it away without a second thought. And it came back to her 1,000-fold. Not because she was owed. Because that's how it works when kindness meets the kind of men who never forget a debt of the heart. She opened the door. That's all. And everything good that followed came through it. So the next time you hear a knock in the dark, remember Ruth Ellery and the one-eyed dog and the last loaf of bread. And open the door.